Our speaker today, Darke, who is a historian, a broadcaster. She's lived in the Middle East for a long time and has written excellent books about the architecture of the Middle East and how it sort of relates to Europe and how we've kind of forgotten that. She was here a couple of years ago speaking about her book, Stealing from the Saracens, and this is kind of a sequel to it, in addition to it, which is Islamesque, the forgotten craftsmen who built Europe's medieval monuments. So we're very happy and pleased that Diana is here with us. What we will do is that she has a presentation, so I was initially going to say something about the book, but then it makes sense for her to actually present the book. And then I'll say a couple of words, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So over to you.
Thanks very much. So, as you were explaining, my new book, Islamesque, is the natural sister volume. It's kind of grown organically out of Stealing from the Saracens. So I couldn't have written Islamesque without having already written Stealing from the Saracens. And just a quick recap. So Stealing from the Saracens is essentially the Islamic backstory of Gothic architecture, and Islamesque is the Islamic backstory of Romanesque architecture. So I'm completely taking on the art history world, the European art history world, and challenging their concept of Romanesque, which, according to all art historians, Romanesque is the essential springboard that leads to Gothic, that leads to the Renaissance, and really sort of kick-starts the whole of the Islamic Renaissance. And so that's fine if that's the view that you hold, but what I'm explaining is that essential springboard, the foundation for everything that Europe then built on, was actually Islamesque, because all of these features came in from the Islamic world. And the book began with a eureka moment, actually. So again, it's not that I always had this plan to write this book, but I had this 20-year fascination with zigzags. And when I bought my house in Damascus, in the old city of Damascus, there was this zigzag pattern running around the courtyard, and it had always mystified me. And I asked my Syrian architect and the craftsman I was working with as we did this 3-year restoration program on the house, what is this zigzag? What's going on there? What's it mean? And nobody could answer. They all just said, well, we don't know, maybe it's some sort of ancient Mesopotamian pattern or whatever, but the meaning of it had been completely lost. And so that's how it stayed for 20 years, until my brother, by chance, said to me, oh, there's a very interesting documentary called The Secret History of Writing. You should watch it. He had no idea about my obsession with zigzags, but by pure chance then, the opening scene of this documentary shows the presenter walking up to an Egyptian temple up in the mountains of the Sinai Desert. And there is the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph on the Temple of Hathor showing as a zigzag. And what the presenter explains is how this symbol of the zigzag is actually the very first phonetic symbol that comes to us as the sound m, because maya, water, that symbol is the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph for water. And as soon as I heard that, I immediately understood what was going on with with my zigzags in my courtyard. Because look, here you've got the spring from which they're emerging, and the water is flowing and it's emerging from the spring and running all the way around the courtyard off into infinity. And as soon as I understood that, as I said, it was just this eureka moment of, right, now I get it. This is water flowing around my courtyard and off into infinity. And what we then discovered was that every single courtyard house dating from the Ottoman times had exactly this pattern running around. So of course, once your eye is trained to notice that kind of thing, you start to see it everywhere. And what I then did was to track it back. So from the ancient Egyptians, it passed into Coptic architecture, and then passed into the Umayyad, the very first Islamic architecture. And here you see the Umayyad palace of Qasr Mushatta, which is now on view in Berlin in the Pergamon Museum. And again, you see this zigzag running through the vegetation there. It's irrigating the vegetation, so it's very clear symbolism of what that's all about. And in all Islamic art, in all the water fountains which you see all over the Arab world, because it's an act of pious donation to put a public drinking fountain somewhere, all of the surface where the water runs down is covered in zigzags. So like this one, this is actually on the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina in Sicily. So this is done by Fatimid artists from Egypt, but in Sicily, in Palermo. And it's that style of the zigzag. You start to see it everywhere. And in Sicily, what happens then, because don't forget, Sicily is ruled for 300 years by Fatimids and then other offshoots of the Fatimids, before the Normans then come and take it from the Arabs. But of course, all those styles pre-exist and they start to enter Norman architecture. So here, this is the Benedictine cloister of Monreale, which is just outside Palermo. And look at the zigzags, they're all running down the fountains. There's actually a fountain in the corner of the cloister there, where the zigzags are running down, again symbolizing water, because of course the people who are actually building these Benedictine monasteries for the Normans now are the local Muslim craftsmen, who are at the top of their game and way, way ahead of anything that the Normans were able to bring in with them. So these local Muslim builders are employed now to work on new Norman cathedrals. And what happens then? So we're talking, the timing here is so key, because this is also the timing of the First Crusade, around about 1096. Just a few years after that, you get zigzags suddenly appearing here in Durham Cathedral. And again, so the Normans bring it from Sicily, and it pops out here in Durham Cathedral. And it's always mystified people. They don't understand that it means water. They just talk about it as the Norman zigzag. And the other thing that happens in Durham for the first time anywhere in Latin Christendom at that time is the ribbed vaulting in the ceiling there. And again, the timing is absolutely critical here. It's no accident that this is all happening just as the Islamic world is starting to implode and collapse. So the fall of Toledo in 1085 is one of those key dates, and Toledo to this day is full of wonderful examples of early ribbed vaulting, because in Muslim Spain they've been experimenting with ribbed vaults, how to support a stone ceiling like that, for over a century beforehand. They were astonishingly advanced. And so what starts to happen now, when I realised this about the zigzag, I thought, my goodness, is this just the tip of the iceberg? What about all the other features that we call Romanesque? Can we track all of those back as well? And when you start to closely examine it all, the timing is key. So in European art history language, they talk about the year 1100 as this sort of magical year when all these Romanesque cathedrals start to appear all across Europe, in northern Spain and in France and Italy and Germany and Britain and even as far as Sweden. And they talk about it, as I mentioned, as this sort of pan-European style. But what these early cathedrals represent, and it's so important to understand the timing of this. So this year of 1100, what was it that suddenly accounted for this miracle, this kind of almost like a virgin birth of incredible architecture all across Europe? What was it that happened? And the timing is absolutely key. because, as I mentioned, this is the time when Christianity is on the rise, and the new Christian rulers are beginning to retake territory from Muslims in Spain and in Sicily. And so the skills are beginning to transfer. And the Muslims, with their astonishing ability with understanding of geometry and mathematics, bring in a whole new set of skills into European architecture. And so this is Ely Cathedral on the left and Lincoln Cathedral on the right. And when you look at all those styles there, I mean, there's obviously the pointed arch, there's the trefoil arch, these rows of arcades, blind arcades, the lobed rose windows, the lozenge shapes. I mean, absolutely everything, you can track it back from the Islamic world, from Muslim Spain, from Muslim Sicily, back across North Africa, and a lot of it from far to mid-Egypt, actually. It's quite fascinating, because these cathedrals, they represent the absolute peak of innovative technology for their day. Astonishing, you know, and nothing just pops out like some sort of miracle in that way. There is a backstory that's been ignored here. So this is what I'm trying to show, this massive backstory, and for it, that's why I've invented the word Islamesque, to say this shouldn't be called Romanesque, because look at it, you know, you can prove all of these elements are in fact entered Latin Christendom via the Islamic world. So that's why the word Islamesque, I'm hoping, will kind of take off and become a proper word in the English dictionary, and will, you know, a certain amount of European art history might have to get rewritten. But in my view, it will be a more accurate version. So this is the earliest rib vaulting that still exists. So this is 10th century. Now, in Muslim Spain, this is Cordoba. This is the Cordoba Mosque, the Cordoba Mesquita, and the geometry involved in this vaulted, ribbed vaulted dome, which is directly above the mihrab in the 10th century extension of the mosque. It was examined only about 5 or 6 years ago by a pair of Spanish structural engineers who were absolutely gobsmacked at the mastery of geometry that it represents. They'd never seen anything like it, and they said it has never needed any structural repair in its entire 1,000-year existence. This is what we're dealing with, you know, the sheer complexity, you know, how to understand the knowledge of algebra, of geometry, which simply did not exist in Latin Christendom at that time. It only existed in Europe, in the areas which were ruled by Muslims, in Muslim Spain and Portugal and in Sicily. And at the back of the Cordoba Mesquita, there is a display of the masons' marks, which were found during a renovation project. And what you can see there is that all the names are Arabic names. These are the masons writing their own names. In the 10th century, these people are literate. This is astonishing. In Latin Christendom, nobody is literate unless they're the absolute elite of the church. You know, but ordinary craftsmen, ordinary people in Muslim Spain were literate because of the schools, the madrasas that were attached to all the mosques, where basic literacy and numeracy was taught to everybody. So this was completely different to anything that existed in Europe at the time. And here's an example of Arabic numerals, which was found by accident in Salisbury Cathedral, in the roof timbers of Salisbury Cathedral, and they're used up there as assembly marks to help the craftsmen, the carpenters, assemble the roof properly. And it was an accidental discovery because they were actually just doing tests to find the date of the wood, but the people noticed these Arabic numerals. And the great mystery was, well, how on earth do you account for Arabic numerals in Britain at a time when they were simply not in use? You know, for 300 years, they were not in use in Britain. Britain was one of the last places to adopt Arabic numerals. I mean, it was only well into the 1500s and early 1600s, and yet these date from the 1200s. So who is going to be using these except Arabs themselves? And look at it, how they are able to do the cursive strokes, just like with the writing, the cursive shapes. European masons and carpenters were only capable of doing simple straight lines, like in Roman numerals. You know, they simply didn't have this kind of ability, and neither did they have the tools to do it. So again, this is elements of proof that you can find if you really start looking for it, as I did, which really prove the only explanation is that Muslims were involved in building these astonishing early cathedrals that just are unlike anything that existed before. And this is Wells Cathedral, very famous, one of the generally regarded in the West facade as one of the best examples of sculpture anywhere in Britain. And again, just look at it. If you start to see it with new eyes, it's full of pointed arches, lozenges, tall blind arches, and here again, some of these sculpture had Arabic numerals on the bases, because what they worked out was that basically they had to put numbers on the bottom to make sure they got put in the right niches. And again, this is a piece of detective work I had to do in the research for the book. How on earth that happened, you know, because again, nobody's really explained it, you know, it was just so mysterious. And the numbers didn't flow, they were all jumbled up in a way that was very baffling. But what I was able to work out was that the timing, so the masons had done all the sculpture work, but then there was this massive legal dispute. The bishop died, and there was a legal dispute between two bishops who wanted to take over, and it had to be referred to Rome, to the court there, and it took 15 years to solve the court case. And in that time, of course, the masons moved on. You know, nobody was paying them, the work stopped, and then they moved on. So what they did was mark up in Arabic numerals the bases of their statues to go into the niches. But after 15 years, when they'd gone and moved on to the next job, which people think was probably Glastonbury, maybe, the local workers couldn't understand what these numbers were. To them, they were just incomprehensible hieroglyphs, so they had no idea. So of course they put them in all the wrong niches, in all the wrong order. They even had to mess about with the shape of the niches to try to make them fit. You know, the whole thing was a nonsense. But what we've worked out now is that if they had been put in the niches that the original Arab sculptors had intended for them, they would all have fitted perfectly. So again, this is another piece of evidence that shows that only Arab sculptors were at this level at that time and using Arabic numerals on British soil. And when, again, you go back and you look at some of the decorative styles, so I've been talking about the geometry, the vaulting, you know, the sheer quality of the structural elements, like the roof timbers. But when you start looking at the decorative features, apart from the zigzag that I've already mentioned, so you go to Muslim Spain, and this is what's called a pyxis. It's an ivory casket that again is from the peak of Muslim Spain, so we're talking 10, and it's got this this beading, this absolutely critical beading here, which runs around in all the frames. It's got animals and people, wrestling. It's always about nature. There's so much going on. You know, there's always life and animation and movement. You know, this is not what people think of as Islamic art, where there aren't people, but essentially. Then the next element there is a Fatimid piece of sculpture from a mosque in Cairo, and this idea of twin figures, either back to back or facing each other. It varies. These happen to be mermaids again, so they're figurative. You know, they're people. And then the final one there, on the far right, is Lincoln Cathedral, where again, look, you've got that beading that I'm just mentioning. So you start to see on Romanesque so-called cathedrals, you start to see these medallions with the beaded frames and the pairs of beasts facing each other or back to back, all the styles of which have entered European architecture in the patterns. And here on the left is part of the renovated ceiling of the Cordoba Mesquita. And again, look at the beading everywhere. You know, it's just, everything is in frames and beading. This is the typical Islamic styles. And then on the right is a piece of Fatimid carving, again, very geometric shape, but with creatures fighting each other. In the top, you know, the symbolic thing of the lion defeating the horse or the gazelle underneath. And so this is the peak of carpentry work in the Muslim world. Way, way beyond anything that existed in Europe at that time. But now what happens is you start to get it in Romanesque cathedrals. So on the left here, this is Peterborough Cathedral, where, again, you've got such a geometric structure there. You've got the lozenges, all of which are in frames. There are 7 frames in every lozenge, and 3 of them are actually zigzags, the frames. The way it's been constructed has been shown to be unlike anything else on British soil at that time. And again, from the research I've done, the techniques I was able to find out have been very similar to what was used in the Cordoba Mesquita ceiling. And on the right-hand side there is another wooden ceiling. Very few of these wooden ceilings have survived because, of course, they were burnt down in fire and then replaced by stone rib vaulting. But these very early ones have survived. So that one on the right is in Hildesheim in Germany. And again, look how geometric it is. It's got the medallions, it's got the frames, the borders, the quatrefoil, the lozenges. Everything is arranged in a geometric format. And the fact that it's got angels and a few usually Old Testament scenes, it's quite striking actually that you don't get many New Testament scenes. So there, the one at the top of Christ in Majesty is actually a much later edition. It's not part of the original iconography there. Because again, Muslim artists knew how to do this. You know, it was familiar to them. Biblical stories were familiar to them. They knew how to do painting. I mean, in the Fatimid court, they used to have competitions between painters, and one painter would say to the Sultan, or to the Caliph, oh my Caliph, I can draw you a picture of a dancing girl coming out from the wall. And so his rival would say, oh my Caliph, I can do you a picture of a dancing girl going into the wall. So they sort of, you know, they were so skilled that they could do perspective and movement, all of these things. They just didn't use it in a religious context. So you didn't find this kind of thing in a mosque, but you did find it in the caliph's palaces, for example, where the top craftsmen were employed to do precisely this kind of courtly scenes, courtly entertainment, musicians, you know, so many things of that sort. Then you get the rose window, of course, so geometric. This one happens to be from Notre Dame, the north rose window. But again, just look how geometrically the whole thing has been framed. You've got the lobing there at the bottom, many different shapes, and it tends to be multiples of 8. Because again, that's very common in Islamic art, multiples of 8, 8-pointed stars and so on. So we've covered the stonemasonry and the carpentry, and the other area where Muslims completely dominated the construction industry in Muslim Spain and in Sicily, and therefore when the Reconquista began and all these top Muslim craftsmen went to work for the new Christian rulers who wanted the best, you know. And one of the techniques that was used, and this is a huge iron bracket, sort of like a stapler, that was used on the top of the walls of cathedrals. So this one was actually found, you know, after the fire at Notre Dame. One of the reasons that the walls didn't collapse was because these huge metal staples were actually holding them in place. So again, so we've got stonemasonry, carpentry and metalwork, all completely dominated by Muslim craftsmen, way ahead of anything that Europe could offer at that time. So this is a Cistercian monastery in Germany where you see those three elements: the stonework, the receding columns there, the woodwork of the door, and the metalwork. Is very typical of everything that was being used in Muslim Spain, and now was being applied in cathedrals all over Europe. So here are a couple of examples where it's actually documented that the craftsmen and builders were Muslim. So the one on the left there is in Poblet, which is another Cistercian monastery, and it looks like an ablutions fountain, doesn't it? I mean, and yet that is where the monks washed their hands on the way into the refectory. And again, you've got the lozenge shapes, you've got the ribbed vaulting. Everything about it is so Islamic, the slender clusters of columns. And then on the right, you've got Lerida Cathedral, which has a kind of cloister, which again looks just like a mosque courtyard. Every single arch in it is different, because that's another thing that's very striking with Islamic architecture, and which then starts to come into Romanesque architecture, is that nothing is symmetrical. It's always different. Every single arch in all the cloisters is completely different, because it's always a kind of imitation of nature, and nature doesn't have right angles. Nature is not symmetrical. Islamic art doesn't care about symmetry in these kind of contexts. You know, they want it to sort of feel more organic. So this is a Benedictine monastery in southern France, Moissac, where, again, you start to see these astonishing examples of carving in all the capitals of the cloister. And look at these slender columns, the pointed arches, you've got these lozenges I've been talking about, and every single capital has got something different. It's got a different fantastical beast, it's got a different kind of foliage. Everything is unlike anything that's ever been seen before, and almost none of it is Christian. There is pretty much nothing there that you can recognisably say, oh yes, that's a biblical scene, because pretty much they didn't do that. And apart from when the bishop himself asked to be put in, as in this particular case he did appear, he wanted himself to be visible as you first entered the cloister. But that's it. He didn't pay attention after that to what the Masons were getting up to on all the other capitals. So this is where you see the real creativity of early Muslim artists in use. And when I say Muslim artists here, of course they could have been Christians, because don't forget there were a lot of Christians living under Muslim rule there, so that they were known as Mozarabs, so they're Arabized Christians. So they also inherited these styles. So the phrase I actually use consistently in the book is schooled under the Islamic tradition. This is another example of a very geometric design, and you look at that and you think, well, that's obviously Islamic. Look at the 8-pointed stars, look at the crescent moons with the sun, you know, the full moon in the middle, the sort of weaving in and out, and then the creatures all around the edge. And yet, this is the reconstructed rose window of Santiago de Compostela, which is, you know, the major Benedictine pilgrimage site controlled by the Benedictines, and it's in those, on the stations on the way to Santiago de Compostela, that they build all their new cathedrals with all these Muslim elements. So this is one of them. This happens to be a church in Clermont-Ferrand, in the Massif Central in France, and they've got the 8-pointed stars running around the edges there in this typical black and white patterning, which is very typical Syrian style of the black basalt contrasting with the white limestone. And you've got interlocking arches is another thing on the right there. You can see it on the outside walls and gates of the Cordoba Mesquita, the interlocking arches. They've got every kind of art represented in Cordoba, in the Mesquita. And then it starts to appear there on the left in Durham Cathedral, in the Galilee Chapel. Exactly the same patterning. And then you start looking at other features which again appear in Romanesque cathedrals. So look at that band of sort of semicircular frieze running around there. That is what Romanesque art historians called Venetian dental. But here it is, in the 9th century. This is the Ribat of Sousse in modern Tunisia. And it's a style which you can see in so many North African palaces and castles and mosques, and then it starts to find its way in to cathedrals. This is in Cairo, the Al-Azhar, again a Fatimid mosque, many later additions, but the courtyard is still the original 10th century patterning, the slender columns, the arcades, the different medallion shapes, the use of frames. And then all this sort of thing starts to appear in the abbeys and monasteries all over Europe. So this is the Maria Laach Abbey, Benedictine Abbey in southern Germany. So you've got the slender columns, you've got the lozenge shapes, the quatrefoils, you've got that so-called Venetian dental everywhere, and there's a fountain in the middle of that little courtyard there, looking just like a mosque forecourt, and it's even called the Paradise in European art history. But it's not just fancy top of the range cathedrals where you start to get all these elements. Curiously, even in some small village churches in Britain, for example, you get these astonishing outpourings. This is a tiny village church in Herefordshire called Kilpeck, and all the elements there, so this is the main entrance into the church. The style there of the Tree of Life, with beading on the frames, you've got pomegranates growing there, the zigzag running across the top, all the fantastical beasts and creatures around the edge, and the style of carving is this very deeply incised carving, very typical of Fatimid work, very unlike any carving that has appeared on British soil before that, where the idea is it's kind of dug out, so rather than projecting up. It's a very, very different way of carving. And then you get images like this, which start to appear in Canterbury Cathedral, in the crypt, which is the oldest part of Canterbury Cathedral. You start getting, this is another capital on a column in the crypt, of fantastical beasts playing instruments, completely crazy scenes, which, of course, the clergy had no idea what was going on here. What on earth are these animals doing in our cathedrals, playing crazy animals? They were utterly mystified, and they came up with preposterous ideas, trying to find Christian meanings in them all. And see the beading on their tails, all the styles that we've come to recognise, the way the wings are done, when the wings are raised, you can see that it's a completely different style to anything that's appeared in European architecture before that. But in the Islamic tradition, the whole thing of animals playing instruments actually goes right back into the earliest Islamic art. So here on the left is a fresco of a bear playing a lute, set in his lozenge frame, and this is a fresco in one of the bathhouse of one of the Umayyad desert palaces. It's Qasr Amra, it's called in modern day Jordan. It's still there. You can go and look at it. The whole of the walls are covered in pictures of crazy beasts doing crazy things, wrestlers doing this and that. Again, because it's courtly entertainment. That's what they're showing. Because this is the caliph's palace, his bathhouse. It's nothing to do with the mosque. And on the right-hand side there, you've got a female musician. Again, courtly scenes. Women quite often played instruments in the caliph's court. And this one is from the ceiling of the Capella Palatina. So it's a Norman palace. So King Roger employs Fatimid craftsmen to come and decorate the ceiling of his private chapel. And it's stuffed full of courtly scenes. The beaded frame is around every single one of them. And just a last final couple of examples. So this is Al-Hakim Mosque in Cairo. And look at the tall blind arches. So again, it's a Fatimid building. Tall blind arches with the lozenge shapes there. So that's 10th and early 11th century. And then in Pisa, the Leaning Tower and the Cathedral of Pisa, you get exactly the same thing. You get the tall blind arches with the lozenge design and these galleries of very elegant arcades. And where has this come from? How has this suddenly appeared? Because Pisa has no tradition of its own architecture. There is no architectural school in Pisa before this. And the reason is that just a decade before, they had captured Palermo, and they must have brought back then some top craftsmen with them. And lo and behold, out it pops. The same old styles, again, reappearing, but in a different Christian context. So this is what I've uncovered. It's been a fascinating journey of discovery, actually. I've often felt more like a detective than anything else, but nobody else is doing it. And I just can't understand why, to be honest, because it's so interesting and it tells you so much about how the styles have moved and why, and the geography fits, the timing fits, and all the styles fit. So it's really quite difficult to refute, because you just see more and more and more examples the more you look and the more you train your eye. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Diana, and yes, it did make sense for us to sort of look at that, and then one can make a couple of comments. Well, one thing which I really do want to kind of highlight here is that what your work really shows in this book and the previous one is that no design or architectural style just emerges out of nowhere. It has a history, it actually has a prehistory, as it's shown here. And I think that's a very critical thing to remember. And then no style, no matter how unique eventually, begins as that. And there are multi-layered sort of things to it. And of course, archaeology has shown us that when you just keep digging deeper, things come up. But I just wanted to kind of, and begin the conversation further from this, point out like two things. Well, one you kind of touch in your work, and I would like to kind of, here of course, because you didn't cover everything in the book, obviously. So do buy the book. That's the more important thing. Because it has wonderful colored pictures of a lot of the things that she spoke about. But one of the things that I'd really ask you to kind of speak about more is that the big thing that is also present in lands that Muslims ruled is Byzantium. The blind arches, all of that's in Hagia Sophia, right? So even before Islam was there, a lot of these elements are there. So how far do you think is the fact that a lot of what is Islamesque is also what was Byzantine-esque for Muslims, and then kind of became Islamesque and kind of went back? And of course, if you look at Byzantium, a lot of what's in Byzantium is Roman originally. So it comes from Roman Greece, and then it becomes Byzantium. And then that break that happens between the East and the West kind of then becomes that critical moment where everything from Byzantium goes to Muslim lands, and then kind of turns around there. So I think that's a very important element. And you very rightly mentioned, one of the very fascinating things is, I had a friend of mine working on Umayyad Spain and also Damascus. And it was very interesting that, he kept looking at names and he just thought they were Muslim. And then he realized that they were Christian Arabs before Islam. So there was a finance person actually called Muhammad, because of course Muhammad is, pre-Islamic, it's just an Arab name. In the same way that one of the finance heads there in Umayyad Damascus was called Abdullah, right? So that's again a very interesting thing which you did mention in your talk. That's, there was this big mixing, and I think architecture was where that conversation between different religions and cultures was happening. This is where all these styles and designs came up, and had a conversation, and the result was bits of Islamic architecture, but then also, as you very rightly point out, in this sort of Romanesque period. So that's one bit that I wanted to speak on. The other bit is something that, and I haven't read all the books, so maybe it's there, but I can't not talk about it because we live in that land, is the influence of Persia. That's a very, very significant thing, and I feel, if you look at Umayyad art and architecture, a lot of that is Persian, right? A lot of that is Zoroastrian, right? So if you would speak a lot about that influence of what then makes it Islamic. So I think what's very, perhaps like you did with your last work, that's, of the medieval period, this goes back, and perhaps I'm trying to push you to go further back and talking about the making of Islamesque. What elements from Persia, Byzantium created that Islamesque that then transformed itself into Romanesque that we now know. And in some ways it's kind of a circling round also. So
yes, that's exactly right, and that's exactly what I do try to show in the book, to try to track all these elements. And they do go right back, way beyond Islamic art, as you rightly say, into Persia, the Achaemenids, particularly, the Sasanians. A lot of it is identifiable there. Some of it has come from India as well. But my point is that it's entered Europe at that point into the cathedrals via the Islamic world. That's why I'm calling it Islamesque. But with Byzantium, yes, as you rightly say, so the Umayyads come in to Syria and they don't have top craftsmen at that point. So when they build the Damascus Umayyad Mosque, they employ the local Christian craftsmen who are the best at that time. And there may have been some mosaicists who were sent from Constantinople, we don't know, it's a bit disputed. But the point is that suddenly you've got the opposite situation where you've got Christian craftsmen working for new Muslim masters, and what they're doing then in the mosaics, for example, in the Damascus Mosque, is instead of doing their usual saints and biblical scenes, they're doing visions of the Islamic paradise with fantasized trees and gardens and rivers. So it's the same thing, but in reverse. And the key is that the top ruler, the new ruler, wants the best. He's not going to go to your average builder around the corner who's not going to build him anything very special. He wants the best, so he gets them from wherever they are, the top people. And as you say, with the names are just all over the place. It's fascinating in Sicily to find Christians called Muhammad, Roger, who was once Ahmad, in legal documents, intermarriage all the time, and the children might be Christian, they might be Muslim. The whole thing was very, very mixed, and a lot of the time there was conversion that might have been genuine, it might not have been conversion, but if you imagine yourself a top Muslim craftsman, and suddenly the politics, the ruler, the top guy has changed, and you've now got a new person from a completely different religion and top, you've still got to feed your family, you've still got to fit in, so you might actually shed your Muslim name, you might adopt a Christian name, and you'll go to work for whoever's paying the bills, basically. So, and they were very much in demand, even quite astonishingly late. Because the key period I identify is about a 200-year period from just before 1100, roughly from the year 1000 to roughly 1250. That key period is where all the Latin sources don't give you any names at all. It's just anonymous. Anonymous masters. There's nobody. Just the bishop. The bishop built this. The abbot built that. You know, he's there. But that's why I call it the forgotten craftsman. There is absolutely no mention of who built these things, except that what modern scholarship does agree on is that it was definitely not the monks. That idea has been debunked long ago. Because again, that was something that was pushed out rather, you know, that, oh, the monks, you know, were divinely inspired. didn't work like that either. So, you know, there are many examples like this which just show how fluid it was. And the other thing about Byzantium, which I think is also important given the timing, is that, so when Islam comes into Syria and Damascus becomes the capital, from that point onwards, from the sort of 8th, 9th, 10th century, when Islam is really on the up and surging, Byzantium is actually in decline. And the Byzantine emperor sitting in Constantinople actually models his own palace on the caliph's palace in Baghdad, because it's better than his, you know, he wants it to be the best that it can be. So, and there's no getting away from it, you know, in Byzantium and in Rome, there is never the pointed arch. And the pointed arch is the key thing that enables the rib vaulting to develop. It's that understanding of geometry, which was not there before. So this is a genuine Islamic contribution.
One thing which I also, and then we'll just open up afterwards, is the question of how this actually creates a global history of design and craftsmanship. Because I think that's another fascinating thing. Global history now is a very in vogue thing, and everyone talks about global history and all of that, and globalization, you know, in the last 20, 30 years. But basically, it was a globalized world in art and architecture 1,000 years ago. And I think it kind of like shows how far it actually goes. But let me just ask you two kind of things which kind of take, well, they kind of go beyond the book, but you know, I think it'll be very interesting to contemplate that. Well, one is, did you find any elements of what we then call sort of Indian architecture there? Sort of, you know, from the subcontinent, what is now Pakistan here. And secondly, how far do you think this marketplace in craftsmen and design, how did it map onto the political scene? Because of course there is a continuous conversation going on there. So if you could kind of, you know, speak about that.
Well, as I explained, the movement is all about where the work is, and where the new demand is, and where the new power and money is, essentially, is what I'm afraid it does tend to point down to.
Follows the money.
Follow the money, that's it. The top people will go to where the money is, because the top people work faster, more efficient. That's the other thing, by the way. The speed with which these early cathedrals were built was just astonishing, absolutely astonishing. And, you know, some of them, you know, built in sort of 2 or 3 years, just because the top people work very fast and they know what they're doing. Again, you know, some local builder, well, for a start, he wouldn't be able to do it, but it would take him ages, you know, even if he attempted it, he just wouldn't know where to begin. So speed is another one of the key elements that is noticeable again and again. So that's one thing. As to your question about Indian art, I mean, it's not something I'm expressly looking at in the book, because as I mentioned, what I'm looking at is how these elements from the Islamic world are entering Europe at that point and manifesting in our cathedrals and castles and monasteries. But I'm sure that obviously some of the styles, I mean, I've noticed it in your museum this morning, you know, you've got the beading in the Gandhara art, you know, you've got some element of frames, so I'm sure it's all passed through, you know, from the Achaemenids. Yeah, I mean, definitely, and tracking it to where it first begins is a very, very interesting thing to do. And the other thing I'm very interested in is to try to unearth the meanings of it, because that's the other thing I've learned, is nothing is random. So everything is there for a reason. And this whole you know, the eight-pointed star. I mean, it's everywhere in my hotel. You know, the tiles in the bathroom are all eight-pointed stars. But everybody I've asked here since arriving, what does the eight-pointed star mean to you? They all look at me blankly and say, what are you talking about? You know. And I'm slightly shocked because the meanings have been lost. So like the zigzag and water has been largely forgotten, except in very few people seem to still know that. But once you see it, you really do understand the art. And I'd love to be able to get to the meanings of some of these other shapes.
I think it's also very fascinating how meaning kind of then changes over time and space. Because, you know, I've very sort of informally done this, but if you look at some things that, you know, in Bengal meant a particular thing, by the time they reached the Punjab here, you know, even in just one subcontinent, the meanings change of the same thing. So again, you know, tracing it over, I think time would be a lot more interested in how it's going from a Muslim ruled territory to a Christian ruled one, and even there, from a Catholic one to eventually a Protestant one, you know, and we didn't get into that, but that's another thing. When these things end up on Protestant lines, what remain and what don't. But anyways, open for questions and comments, please.
Thank you for the very enlightening lecture. I was wondering, you talked about ironwork, metalwork, you talked about carving and the various patterns that have been imported and incorporated by British craftsmen. What about stained glass? Because that's something, to my knowledge, was the center was Syria, and it was shipping out these large chunks of colored glass to various areas to decorate mosques and madrasas and bathhouses. How does that connect with what was happening in Britain? Because suddenly this glorious rose window, which you see in cathedrals, comes about.
Yeah.
Was there a trade between, or was it something that the Romans had left in Britain, the craftsmanship, the artisans, and they were then redoing it to the new requirements? What was it? Was it Islamic, or was it leftover of the British Roman?
This is actually something I cover quite extensively in Stealing from the Saracens rather than this book. So glass is a whole area that I go into in some detail in Stealing from the Saracens. And yes, you're absolutely right. Syria was the world leader in glass, and Damascus was the great centre, and the colours, as you say, the quality of the glass itself, the ingredients using this plant ash, Oshnan, which was way, way better and superior in terms of its quality, its strength, compared to the Roman use of natron as the flux. You know, it makes for a very different kind of glass. And again, one of my theories actually about why the stained glass in Notre Dame didn't just all shatter was, I think a lot of it was Syrian glass, which is, because it's got these bubbles in, it's very organic and very strong, and it's soft to work with, so craftsmen loved working with it, way, way superior to anything Roman. The styles were very strikingly used in those ways, and scientific studies have actually shown what they call the Islamic composition in some of the glass. You know, so it's now that they've got the technology, they can actually, by using these special machines, analyse the ingredients and can detect where the glass came from. And so, again, I believe that as they start doing this more and more, so far they've found the Islamic composition in Chartres Cathedral and in Durham, York, I think, in England, and I think it was Rouen, a couple more places, but they haven't done very much of it, so there's a lot more work that needs to be done there. But yeah, a lot of it's coming from the Islamic one. And again, in Stealing from the Saracens, I show that early rose window, which is from one of the Umayyad palaces, where they reconstructed it and they found the coloured glass underneath it. and they worked out that the original decorative window was high in the caliph's audience hall. So again, it was used to cast a sort of special magical light, exactly the same sort of principle as stained glass in cathedrals.
Hi, thank you so much. Over here, for a very edifying talk. This is music to our ears, because we've known that, you know, all of the Greek works were transmitted back to Europe through Arabic. The zero was invented by Indians and Mayans, etc. But in the West, there's this fiction that somehow the West is more advanced and has been intellectually more advanced. And in particular nowadays, with Fortress Europe and the sense that Islam is invading, or Islamic people, or people who have darker skin tones, are entering Europe and are sort of swamping it, and they can't afford it, and alien to the so-called Christian tradition or European tradition, or the newest fiction, which is a Judeo-Christian tradition. So how has your work been received amongst Europeans, amongst Britons, and particularly art historians who worked on the medieval European period?
Great. Could we just actually take a few more questions and then take a few more questions and
No,
then...
Yaqoob better answer this one.
Well,
Because I think she, no, let me do that.
I mean, it's one of the main motivations that, for writing my books, to be honest, because it just strikes me as very unfair that there should be this almost sort of demonization of Muslims, and this big association with negativity and war and violence, you know, which has sadly sort of turbocharged since 9/11, and you know, all the ISIS and extreme terrorism that seems to a lot of people in the West to have all come out of Islam, you know, and so they, unfortunately, it does give it a very bad name. So because I honestly believe what I'm writing about in my books, it's not that I'm setting out with some agenda. I mean, I found all this stuff out, you know, through my researches, and I genuinely believe it to be true, and I therefore think it's right to show it, just to say, look, this needs to be straightened out. This huge debt to the Muslim world needs to be acknowledged, because they gave us this massive foundation, which we were then able to build on. And as you rightly mentioned, with the Arabic manuscripts and things, just to give you one example, in the monasteries in northern Spain, they thought themselves extremely learned if they had 300 or 400 Arabic manuscripts in their libraries, whereas the Caliph's library in Cordoba had something like maybe 40,000. Yeah. And I mean, you know, there was one Pope, Sylvester II, I think he was called, who actually became an Arabic scholar, and you know, he was known as the scientist Pope, because he actually he ran away from his monastery in France and went and sought out learning with Saracen philosophers, and learnt a huge amount, and then became the Pope for a couple of years, you know. So there were these astonishing examples, which again ought to be known about, ought to be more widely known about. And I would like to see this kind of knowledge enter the education system, so that people in Europe actually learn about this stuff and it becomes common knowledge.
Thank you so much for today's session. It was really informative. My question is, were you able to find any data regarding to considering that most traditional schools of craftsmen, they work under an ustad, a mentor-mentee system, and that's how it's happened, with the transfer of knowledge taking place generation over generation. So have you been able to identify or see any or gather any information on the kind of schools that had influence on the European architecture and the specific traditions?
I've done a little bit of work on the guilds, if that's what you're referring to, the guilds, and that's been fascinating, because what I've established is, for example, the Fatimids were huge patrons of the arts, and they, the Islamic guilds there were open to Christians and Muslims completely. You know, anybody who was good enough could join it. It was entirely based on merit. what happened then in Muslim Spain was once the Christian rulers came in and the Reconquista began and the transfer of knowledge began, a process which I estimate took about 100 to 200 years. What happened then was that the Christians started to create their own guilds from which they excluded Muslims and Jews. I mean, Christianity is something, again, that's quite struck me during my research, has this desire to be exclusive, whereas Islam has this desire to be inclusive. It's really quite a stark difference, and it's quite striking, and it shows in the architecture too, so that a church, by and large, is a long, thin building with a huge sense of hierarchy, long and thin, important people up at the altar end, only top people are allowed to sit in the front row, all of that kind of stuff, and then the mosque, circular, no hierarchy, you can sit wherever you want, you don't even know where the important bit is, apart from the mihrab giving you the direction of prayer. It's a very, very different way of thinking about space. Christianity seems to have this need, the whole hierarchy of the priesthood, that they put themselves there as the intermediary. You can only reach God through me, so you have to, pay your donations and whatever, and make the church rich, and then you'll find your way to heaven, via me. Whereas, Islam doesn't have that way of thinking. You don't need an intermediary, which is good on one level because it's just you and God. But what it also means, and this is something that I think the Western world doesn't fully understand, is that when terrible things happen, like 9/11 or whatever, there is no one figurehead in the Islamic world who can stand up, sort of like the Pope, and make an announcement. And so this is something else that gets commented on. Why haven't any Muslim leaders come out and said something? But because it's that hierarchy isn't there, to sort of speak with one voice in that sense. It's not how Islam works. And again, it's a misunderstanding, I think, in the Western world about these things, to realise how differently Islam and Christianity are structured.
One last question.
Now, do you come across Muslim mosaic makers? I mean, I think of the tremendous Byzantine traditional mosaics, which you would have seen in Damascus. And I think they start coming and being felt really perhaps a bit later than the period that you're talking about. But do you see any mosaic tradition in the world that you've looked at?
Well, different types of people have their specialisms, and there's no doubt that the top mosaicists tended to be Christian, and the ones from Syria, Antioch and Constantinople were the top ones. And it's not a craft in which Muslims excelled in the same way that they did, for instance, in stonemasonry and in carpentry. So they were able to do it a bit later, as you said, but definitely, within the early centuries that we're talking about, it was a Christian specialization.
And I think one thing, which of course, we're out of time, which we haven't even sort of spoken about, is the Armenian influence in all of this. And of course, they have an ancient tradition of mosaic, which is even pre-Christian actually, for that matter. But thank you so much, Diana. I think you've shown us this multi-layered history that we have. And it's been an amazing talk. And I think, again, as you rightly showed, that this needs to be taught everywhere, and we need to engage with this further. Thank you very much.